Welcome back, class, to today's Explainer. Go ahead and take your seats. We've got a truly crucial lesson ahead of us today. We're looking at one of the absolute most transformative periods in American history, the 1960s Civil Rights Movement. And specifically, we're going to trace the direct, undeniable line from grassroots protests in the streets all the way up to the highest courts in the land. With the Regents exam coming up in just 22 days, this is material you absolutely need to understand deeply, not just memorize. So get those notebooks out and let's get started.
Okay, let's kick things off with our do now. I want you to reach back and recall our previous discussions. What were the early protest tactics of the Birmingham campaign, specifically the Children's Crusade? And what was their ultimate main goal? Really think about how they actually tried to force a deeply segregated city to finally change its ways.
Well, if you wrote down that they used sit-ins, marches, and boycotts, you hit the nail on the head. The strategy here wasn't just random, it was incredibly calculated. The goal of these brave young people was to literally overload the local jail system. They wanted to stretch the city's resources to the absolute breaking point just to force city leaders into negotiations. But above all, their main goal was to peacefully dramatize the profound injustice of segregation. They were forcing the entire nation to finally look racial violence directly in the eye.
Now, what's really fascinating is the reaction these protests sparked. Bull Connor, the local police commissioner, responded to these peaceful youth protests with just unimaginable brutality. And the critical factor here? It was all caught on camera. National television audiences across America sat in their living rooms and were completely horrified. They were watching police turning high-pressure fire hoses and attack dogs on children. This wasn't just a local issue anymore. This visceral, visual evidence of brutality caused a massive surge in nationwide support for the civil rights movement.
So, here is our lesson plan for today. We're going to trace this narrative arc step by step, starting with the Birmingham Children's Crusade, the March on Washington, the Senate filibuster roadblock, how LBJ passes the act, the Supreme Court test, and then we'll wrap up with what comes next.
Let's start with Section 1, the Children's Crusade of the Birmingham Campaign. Moving right along to Section 2, the March on Washington. The localized outrage we saw in Alabama was rapidly transforming into a highly organized federal push. The movement was basically taking the energy of the streets and marching it directly to the steps of the nation's capital.
Organizers like A. Philip Randolph had actually called for this march back in March of 1963, and the sheer horror of the Children's Crusade directly fueled the urgency to make it happen. By May of 1963, leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis were fully backing the march. They knew, without a doubt, that they needed a massive show of unity to push for a federal civil rights law.
And when August 1963 arrived, the response was just staggering. 300,000 people. Just let that number sink in for a second. 300,000 citizens assembling peacefully in Washington, D.C. It was an unprecedented demonstration of solidarity for jobs and freedom, and it created an immense, undeniable pressure on the federal government to act.
It was at this monumental gathering that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his soaring "I Have a Dream" speech. He elevated the moral urgency of a civil rights law so clearly, demanding a society where, in his words, "my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." It was a powerful vision that resonated deeply across the entire world.
Now, into Section 3, the Senate filibuster roadblock. Because as we know in U.S. history, an inspiring speech doesn't just magically become a law overnight. Following the momentum of Birmingham and the march, President John F. Kennedy had formally asked Congress for a civil rights law in June 1963. But that request slammed right into the bureaucratic mud of the United States Congress.
To understand why it stalled, you need to grasp this key civic concept, the filibuster. This is a Senate rule where a minority of senators can essentially talk a bill to death, completely blocking a vote from even happening. Opponents of civil rights used the filibuster to stop the legislation dead in its tracks. They knew that if it actually came down to a simple majority vote, it might pass, so they just refused to yield the floor.
So class, think about this. How do you beat a roadblock like that? Well, you need a supermajority. Specifically, the supporters of the civil rights law needed exactly 60 votes in the Senate to overcome the filibuster and force a vote on the actual bill. And let me tell you, getting 60 votes on such a contentious issue seemed almost impossible at the time.
Which brings us to Section 4. LBJ passes the act. In November 1963, The nation was absolutely shattered by the tragic assassination of President Kennedy. His successor, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, stepped into the Oval Office. And LBJ was fully committed to passing the Civil Rights Act as a tribute to JFK's legacy, but also because he recognized it was simply time.
And this is exactly why LBJ was the man for the moment. LBJ wasn't just any politician. He was the former Senate Majority Leader. He knew the Senate rules inside and out. He knew the senators, he knew their weaknesses, what they wanted, and exactly how to pressure them. He utilized his deep Senate connections, his well-known intimidation tactics, and his political mastery to finally break that seemingly impossible 60-vote filibuster threshold.
So the crucial takeaway here is that when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 finally passed, it fundamentally reshaped American society. This landmark law outlawed discrimination and segregation in public accommodations, meaning hotels, theaters, and restaurants could no longer turn people away based on race. It banned segregation in public facilities and education, which opened up schools, libraries, and parks to everyone. And critically, it banned discrimination in employment based on race, color, national origin, religion, and sex.
All right, settle down, class, because passing a law is only half the battle. We've arrived at Section 5, the Supreme Court test. Think of this as the boss battle of the lesson. Whenever a massive, society-altering law is passed, it inevitably faces a legal challenge to test its constitutionality.
This challenge came in the form of the Heart of Atlanta motel case in 1964. The owners of this motel flat out refused to accept Black Americans, actively defying the brand new Civil Rights Act. And this forces us to ask a major constitutional question. Can Congress actually ban discrimination in private, locally owned businesses?
Let's break down this constitutional clash. On one side, we have the motel's claim. They argued their business was strictly contained within the borders of one single state, Georgia. Therefore, they claimed the federal government had absolutely no right to tell them who they could or couldn't serve. But in response, the federal government pointed to the Constitution, which gives Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce, meaning trade and business that crosses state lines.
The Supreme Court had to make a decision, and here's what they ruled. They declared that because the motel was located near major highways and because its customers traveled from all over the country, crossing state lines just to stay there, the motel was undeniably engaging in interstate commerce. Therefore, under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was entirely constitutional. Congress absolutely had the power to ban discrimination in these businesses. Okay, Section 6, what comes next? We've covered incredible ground today, from the fire hoses in Birmingham to the gavel of the Supreme Court. But as we wrap up this explainer and prep for that upcoming Regents exam, we have to look ahead. Because the fight continues. History doesn't just stop at one victory.
See, despite the monumental victory of the Civil Rights Act ending legal segregation in public life, a massive, glaring inequality remained. Tactics like literacy tests that asked literally impossible questions and poll taxes demanding money just to vote, these were still actively and deliberately disenfranchising Black voters all across the South.
Which points us directly to the ballot box. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a massive triumph for integration, for sure, but it did not fully protect electoral equality. The fight for voting rights was just beginning to reach its boiling point.
So, I want to leave you all with a final provocative question to ponder before the bell rings. Think about everything we discussed today. Was outlawing segregation on paper enough to guarantee true equality in America? Or does true equality require something more? Keep that question rolling around in your minds as we prepare for our next lesson. Study your notes, and I'll see you all next time.